By the way, Mrs. Nemirovskaya, we both obviously not only share some political interests, we even share nearly the same birthday, and I will take the opportunity to congratulate on your birthday just a few days ago. Well, my second introductory remark is my, gratitude for your generosity to invite me just to address you on which issue ever. So I feel entitled to say whatever I think I could or I should without running the risk of being accused for avoiding to address the issue which doesn't exist. But my understanding of your conference is that there exists an issue. And I wouldn't exclude that at least some of you might expect me to make some remarks on this issue. And I'm a bit nervous to feel whether at the end you have got the impression, well, it had a bit to do with our subject and was not too far away. My approaching to what I understand your subject is the reference to two different historic events or marks in our younger history, starting with the General Declaration of Human Rights precisely 70 years ago. It was immediately after the Second World War and in the context of establishing United Nations, when those nations participating in this process thought it would be an appropriate idea to define what beyond national borders and national traditions and national cultures, universal principles could be or should be. You are all aware with the major subjects of this declaration, so there is no need to refer to them in detail. But please answer for yourself the question whether you think that precisely the same declaration of universal rights could be adopted by the United Nations today, 70 years later. As it was my year of being born, you will understand that I have a rather rough memory of the debate at that time. But what I have read in the meantime is that at that time there was some speculation how long it could last to implement what has been expressed as universal principles. Now, 70 years later, the more realistic question is whether we still understand these principles as universal principles, or whether we live in a period of our history in which even adopted principles become eroded. And this is the reason for my second point of reference, which I would like to make, and which is nearly precisely 25 years ago. And this means it is a time after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, after this unprecedented transformation of political systems in Middle and Eastern Europe, after the breakdown of authoritarian socialist systems, and after the establishment of parliaments and governments being the result of free elections. All of you certainly remember that it was precisely in this historic context when an American scientist published a book which during only a few months became a world bestseller. Francis Fukuyama, The End of History. The End of History. What he thought was, of course, not that we were approaching the formal final of mankind. But what he thought and meant and wrote was that fundamental questions of how a modern society should be organized could be regarded as being concluded. And by the way, this book, as many others, wouldn't have become a bestseller without meeting the understanding of a global audience. This was the global understanding at that time, that at least for modern societies, for enlightened liberal societies, the only acceptable political system would be a democracy. And insofar his conclusion seemed valid, this question is now being concluded. This is obvious. You have to have a democracy in order to organize a society politically. And the other point, which he thought was now similarly obvious, was that only market systems could organize a modern economy appropriately. And by the way, after the decision of a communist Chinese party to start this, well, highly interesting and ambitious project to combine an authoritarian political system with a market economy, it seemed at least as clear that even a developing economy, being interested to become a developed modern economy, would have to be organized as a market system and could no longer be organized by central planning. Again, this is only 25 years ago. And I have no doubt that the same book today would rather create irritations than applause. Most of us would ask him whether he had obviously overseen younger developments in the respective countries, in which, if at all the old questions which seemed to be concluded have been put again on the table. What about democracy? What about market system? What about the ultimate organization of modern societies? We have an interesting development as far as democracy is concerned. My understanding is that it took not only a long time in the history of mankind to develop this model in an ambitious sense. It's of course true that the term democracy already exists then more than 2,500 years, but what the old Greeks understood as democracy is so far away from our minimum standards that the only identity is the term, but not the structures of the respective systems. But again, given the experience that it took more than 2,000 years within the context of Western civilization to establish what we now understand as democracies, it took again more than 200, 300 years to implement this understanding in the majority of Western countries. And by the way, we now live in a European continent in which for the first time ever, without any exemption, all countries are governed by freely elected governments and parliaments. This is the first time in the history of Europe and in the history of mankind as well that we have this definitely not self-understanding situation. This seems to underline the trend and the implementation of democracy as the only political system, including the effect that even countries like China, for example, like Russia, not to speak about several African and other Asian countries, would have refused, at least wouldn't have even thought to adopt the term democracy for themselves, and in the meantime are eager to claim this term. By the way, to illustrate this observation, as President of the German Parliament, I was simultaneously for more than a decade the leader of the German delegation to the International Parliamentary Union, which is the global organization of parliaments. And believe it or not, in the meantime, this international organization has nearly as much member countries as the United Nations. Although it is obvious that we still have a limited number of serious parliaments in the world. But in the meantime, no country likes being blamed not to be a democracy. And so the attractiveness of the term is obviously much more widespread than the ambition of what this term seriously means. And so I am again approaching the question of universalism. What do we still have as universal principles, as universal orientations of universal standards of organizing a democracy? Let me quote an exciting empirical study being published in the summer this year by two Norwegian institutes which studied the question or the issue of the acceptance of political systems and the respective governments in not less than 50 countries in the world. This study, which I am quoting, took place by interviews with no less than 125,000 people in 50 countries, with several highly remarkable results. First result, the majority of people all over these 50 countries declared that they feel that their interests have nearly nothing to do with the interests being implemented by their respective governments. And that they don't have got the impression that politics is about their aims, their intentions, their interests. This is not so surprising for European experiences, including German ones. Perhaps it's a bit more surprising to see that this hesitation and this complaint is much more developed in countries which still feel obliged to implement universal principles of democracy than in countries which are still or just now far away from these principles. More than 60% in Western countries complain on this discrepancy between their own interests and the agenda of the respective government. It is definitely not exaggerating to say that we have since some time a serious crisis of trust in developed democratic systems. And it is at least interesting to observe that this mistrust has increased precisely in the same period during which democracy should have been established as the only acceptable political system. But I will tell you another exciting result of this study. Being asked what the people which have been interviewed think on their political system, the political system in their respective country, what they think on their government, the highest acceptance of a given political system in this very moment exists in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and China. Well, that's the message. At least it makes it unavoidable to be aware that we simultaneously not only have, obviously, a crisis of trust in democratic principles, we obviously also have a crisis in the judgment of people on political systems, developments, tendencies, which obviously don't meet the same standards of being evaluated. So again, let me conclude with coming back to my starting remarks. 70 years ago, we thought, after the traumatic experiences of 2 world wars being executed on European soil, 70 years ago, we thought we would at least be able to define what the universal standards for societies should be, being aware that we hadn't got the implementation in the majority of countries being addressed by these principles. 70 years later, we are neither in the position of delivering the message, we have got it. Now these principles are not only being defined, they are implemented. On the contrary, we have to be aware and deal with a situation that we are probably much more far away from the intention of the United Nations 70 years ago than we thought we could be. What does this mean in political terms? Does this mean it was an obviously too ambitious goal and we better refuse to follow it in the future because it has proved to be an unrealistic one? No. I personally would refuse to accept this conclusion. But at the same time, I have no illusions that there is no probability, not even a serious chance, to just expect this result in the foreseeable future. On the contrary, my not only virtual question, whether you think the same Declaration of Universal Rights could be adopted again just now, includes my experience that major countries like China offensively declare they have other orientations. And their orientations reflect in a similar way another cultural tradition, other historical experiences, and with some plausibility refused to be confronted with a model, with a system of principles which obviously has been generated within the Western civilization. So if we neither can seriously expect that there is a globally undisputed accepted system of universal principles, nor are prepared to accept completely other standards for the future, as those which we have or our predecessors have defined in the General Declaration 70 years ago. It is our job to care about those principles which we think should be valid. And it depends completely on ourselves. I probably don't have explained to you the advantages of democracies compared to other political systems. But from time to time, we have to explain ourselves that one of the major disadvantages of democracies is precisely that it is not a self-sustaining system. It depends on the engagement of its citizens. And insofar, it's we. We decide what about universalism in the future? What about those principles which we thought and hopefully still think should be valid? Thank you for your patience.